Okay, this is Dr. Bishop once again. I'm going to give a lecture on behavior genetics, which is part of the biological paradigm, but is important method by which causes for abnormality are studied. So, important to understand what behavior genetics is, and it differs from molecular genetics, which is really the focus on DNA and specific genes and how they're expressed in their chemical and biological processes. This is not. This is totally different. The term again, molecular genetics. Behavior genetics is the study of the relative influence of genetics and environmental factors on behavior. So you start with a particular trait, for example, whether somebody is schizophrenic, whether somebody, a trait of, say, height, or some particular trait that you're interested in. And then through different studies, twin studies, family studies, and adoption studies, you try to determine the relative influence of genetics versus environment. So there are some important terms here. First of all, genotype, and that refers to all the genetic material that is inherited by a person. So that refers to both dominant genes, recessive genes, genes that are expressed, genes that are turned on, genes that are not turned on. A lot of these are unobservable and you would never know that you had them, but they are part of your genotype. The phenotype is actually observable characteristics and behavior. It's what you see as an end state of the product of the interaction of your genes and your environment. So that would be something like your height, your IQ, whether you have a particular mental disorder, and so forth. Heritability is a complex concept, and basically it has to do with variation in phenotypes in what you observe, that is, whether or not, for example, you're schizophrenic, and whether you are or not is due to genes or environment, and the degree to which they're attributed to genetic factors, they're said to be heritable. And then there's a fairly complex statistical procedure. As you can simplify it, but you can get an estimate of heritability from outcomes of twin studies, but the outcomes, the heritability estimates range from 0 to 100%. 100% would indicate it's completely heritable, 0% not genetically not heritable at all. So to give an example of this, suppose you have some flowers, and some of them you put in flower pots and you keep them in a particular environment. You water them pretty much the same. They get about the same amount of sunlight. You give them the same kind of nutrition as they're raised in the same soil. In this case, when you see differences, say, in height, they're probably due to basic differences in the genes, because the environment that you have produced is roughly the same for all of them. So when you see situations like this, you can pretty much say that the genetic differences in height are due probably to genes, and so the heritability estimate will be close to 100%. On the other hand, if you get out into the yard and you scatter if you plant flowers one place or another, same type of flower, and then you see differences between them that are pretty great. Since their environments have probably been different, one gets more sunlight, one gets more rain, maybe the soil is different, but the environmental factors are varying between these plants. So then any differences you see will probably be due not only to genes, but also environmental factors. And so your heritability estimates, when you have a lot of variation in environmental influences, will clearly be less than 100%. So here's a review question. Which of the following is a phenotype? Height, intelligence, extroversion, all of the above. The answer is D, all of the above. And in the sunflower example, which group of flowers had the greater variability regarding environmental factors that could influence flower growth? And the answer is the yard group. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you have different methodologies to study the relative influence of genes versus environment. There are family studies, adoption studies, and twin studies. The basic idea, I'll explain each of them here and give an example if I can. So in family studies, the basic idea is that if you have some disorder and it's genetically influenced, that you should see a family history. It should run in families. And that's one of the first things when you see especially problematic problems like cancer or schizophrenia or Huntington's disease or just almost any kind of, especially medical condition. You want to know if it runs in the family. You want to know if it's been, if genes have been passed down, and that's what's at least partly responsible for it showing up. The person, by the way, that actually has the disorder or trait that's being studied is often referred to as the proband or the index case, and that's the starting point for studies of all of these types of research studies. So in general, if you find that it does run in families, unfortunately there's confounding between genetics and environment because families share more than just genes. They share a common environment, common attitudes, common parenting, common nutrition, and so forth. So you can't untangle the two and just conclude that it's mostly genetic and that environment doesn't have an influence. Adoption studies, however, are a little more powerful. Actually, they may be the most powerful of the three types of studies. You compare genetically related and unrelated family members. So basically, you would start with somebody that has the disorder. And here you're talking about a situation, actually it's a little different. You take somebody that has the disorder, say a schizophrenic mother who has a child, can't take care of the child, and the child is adopted out. So you're talking about children that are adopted. So the proband would be the child that came from a schizophrenic mother. And then you want to look at that, and then you want to see if other children that are adopted or natural family members get the disorder to the same degree as the proband. If, in fact, genetics play a role, the child that has been adopted from a schizophrenic mother, for example, will manifest a higher likelihood of schizophrenia than children adopted from non-schizophrenic parents. And in fact, that's exactly what happens. It's really rather striking. The rate of schizophrenia in adoptive families, even families that are somewhat dysfunctional, is near the base rate, which is 1%, but it can be much higher for adoptees whose mother has been schizophrenic, maybe 20-30%. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but there's a high rate of that has been found of adoptive kids of schizophrenic moms also being schizophrenic. So the third type of study is a twin study. And basically the idea here is the degree to which people share genes, and if it's a genetic disorder, then they're more likely to also have the disorder. So you take twins which share 100% of genes and twins who share 50% of genes, that is monozygotic and dizygotic twins, and you take and see when one has a disorder, whether the second also has a disorder. And here, for example, say you had 100 identical twins, one of whom had schizophrenia and the other you didn't know. And same for fraternal twins. Then you study the non-affected twin to see if they also develop the disorder. If so, you say they are concordant. And it turns out, for example, in schizophrenia, identical twins are much more likely. An affected twin pairs, if one has it, the second one is about 50% likely to have it also. Whereas if they only share, in dizygotic twins will only share maybe 50% of genes, the rate is much lower, say 15%. So the heritability estimate is usually calculated. This is just a general formula, and there are many formulas, but you take the correlation between the affected twin, the proband, and the other twin, and to see if they're concordant. So it would be 50% here for identical twins, say 10% here for fraternal twins, and so you subtract 0.1 from 0.4, or actually it's 0.5, so if you subtract 0.1 from 0.5, you get 0.4, and then you double that figure, and it comes out to 0.8, and you convert it to a percentage, it's 80% heritability would be the figure. An important point about heritability is that the estimates apply to differences among individuals, not to individuals per se. So, if you got heritability of 60% for body weight, that does not mean that a 100-pound woman, 60 pounds comes from her genes, 40 pounds from her environment. What it does mean is if you've got a group of people, and maybe they vary between 100 and 200 pounds, and a sample of people, that you could say if you got a heritability estimate, 60% of the variability in body weight was due to differences in genetics. The remaining 40% due to environmental factors, for example, nutrition. So, another important point is that heritability is not a fixed property of a phenotype. So if you get a little variability in the environment, environmental factors, for example, the flower pot example, then the differences you see are probably going to be due to genetics. So the heritability estimate will be higher. If you get a lot of variability in the environmental factors, it could influence a trait. For example, the yard example with flowers, then your heritability estimates will be lower, at least less than 100%, because the environmental factors are having an influence. So important to understand the characteristics of the sample used by the researchers. In general, if you have samples where there's a lot of variability, or one where heredity is playing more, it looks like it might play more of a role, depending on the sample, your estimates and your of heritability will be different. In fact, for different samples, you get different figures. So instead of just saying heritability is some fixed amount, like 80%, depending on the sample, it could be 70%, or 85%, or so forth. So they talk about estimates or ranges for heritability figures. And even if you have a really heritable trait, it's pretty clear that it could be modified by the environment. IQ, for example, is pretty highly heritable, about 70%, 80%. But it's pretty clear that, you know, if you have environmental stimulation early on, that you can modify IQ. So the environment interacts and modifies the trait, turns the genes on, and so forth. Which of the following statements is true? Highly heritable traits cannot be modified by environmental factors. If the heritability of height is 90% and I'm 72 inches tall, this means that I get 64.8% inches for my gene. And that both of those first two are false, and actually the answer is C. If the heritability of IQ is 75%, it means that individual differences in IQ are more strongly influenced by genetics than environment. It turns out that when you find environmental factors are important, that you can break this group into two parts, as shared and non-shared events or environmental factors. For example, if you have siblings, you grew up in a particular family, you probably had the same number of books in the home, presence or absence of TV, quantity and quality of food, all of these things here, the school you went to, place of worship you went to, these were shared by you and your siblings. So they were shared environmental factors. Non-shared environmental factors are unique to each family member. Like, you know, youngest child, first child often get treated differently. That's a non-shared environmental factor. You have different friends. You have different teachers who have different influences. The person you get involved with will be different. That's a non-shared environmental factor. You have different interests in extracurricular activities. So there's many things that family members do not share that are unique to each family member. And as it turns out, non-shared environmental factors are more important in development of mental illness. So if you find environmental factors are having an influence, it's specific maybe to a particular person's upbringing, environmental influence factors that are unique to that person. So in the big picture, heredity plays a role in most behavior. Genes don't operate in isolation from the environment. This is a really important point, and people do not understand this, but environment shapes how our genes are expressed. So it turns out that certain things you turn genes off or on, and then they get expressed. They interact to produce behavior. And a great example of this in the area of mental health is in the area of depression. It turns out that when you have different alleles of a particular gene, the serotonin transporter gene, that you, depending on the combination you get, you're more likely to be depressed. In other words, this is a vulnerability or a diathesis or a predisposition. So it turns out that only occurs if you have maltreatment also in the picture. So some of the combinations you could have with this particular gene are you could have two shorts, two longs, or one short and one long. And people with two shorts and a short and a long and childhood maltreatment were depressed as adults. A risk was higher for SS. However, neither SS or SL nor maltreatment by itself predicted depression. It had to be both. So you had to have a diathesis and then a stress of the maltreatment. So here's a picture, here's a graph that shows this interaction. So you have no maltreatment, and without that, you have a certain amount of depression, but there's no variation in terms of genetic variation. When you get severe maltreatment, if you have a certain kind of gene, then it doesn't increase the likelihood very much, if at all, of developing depression. But if you have the too short alleles of the gene, then when you get severe maltreatment, you react differently, and it doubles the rate of depression. Most psychological disorders are polygenic. That means there are several genes, perhaps hundreds. Height, for example, is influenced by at least 100 genes. These genes are operating at different times during development sometimes, and they turn themselves on and off depending on environment and other factors. So it gets to be a very complex picture. And it's also important to realize that the relationship between genes and environment is bidirectional or reciprocal. So you have, if you eat the wrong things, you have a lot of stress, you have certain kinds of relationships. These things actually influence your genes and turn them on or off, and then they express themselves. You get depressed or not. Genes they also predispose individuals to experience situations that increase or decrease the likelihood of developing a disorder. So if you're extroverted, then you're more likely to go out and drink alcohol. Then you're more likely, because you drink a lot of alcohol, maybe to develop alcohol use disorder. Genes may cause a person to be high in hostility, may cause a person to have more difficult relationships, increasing the risk for depression. So the point is, the gene predisposes you to certain environmental situations. So the genes influence the environment also can influence the genes. This again is called a reciprocal gene-environment interaction. So which of the following statements is true? Environmental factors influence genes. Genetic factors influence particular environments to which we're exposed, or both. Answer is both. Okay, I'm going to stop here.